Seems to be working as it should be. So let me just say good afternoon or morning or evening across the wide span of geography that just the participants in this webinar are representing, to say nothing of the audience. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm Director of Academic Affairs for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. And I want to thank you for being with us today. And of course, I want to thank the speakers for being with us today. And with that, my role in this program comes to a close, and it's my pleasure to turn things over to our friend and colleague, Professor Laura Asturian of Bentley University, who will be engaging in dialogue with our speaker and author, Nadia Owusu. Laura, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Seismic Histories in Nadia Owusu's Aftershocks. My name is Laura Storian, and I'm delighted to host this event devoted to the theme of history in Owusu's Whiting Award-winning memoir, Aftershocks, published by Simon & Schuster in 2021. Aftershocks has been praised widely, both in literary circles and in the mainstream press. The New York Times calls it a gorgeous and unsettling memoir, and as observed in the LA Review of Books, it takes a skillful hand to weave complex concepts so seamlessly into a narrative, and Owusu executes this masterfully. According to LitHub, Aftershocks is a deeply intimate, heartbreakingly honest, and a book that will likely reverberate throughout our hearts and minds long after we've finished reading. Indeed, I agree. And those who have read the book marvel at its richness and the way it moves seamlessly and artfully from the micro to the macro, from the self, the intimate, to the collective, the political, and of course, the historical. So today's event emerged initially as a unique community collaboration between Nasser and the Bentley University Department of English and Media Studies and Modern Languages, where I work. Given the historical focus of Nasser in particular, it seemed both apt and fruitful to take a closer look at Owusu's incorporation of indelible historical events and historical research into the narration of her own story. Incidentally, Owusu herself has roots in the Boston area, where both Nasser and Bentley are located. But also fittingly, given the scope of the book, this event is co-sponsored by groups scattered all over the world, from Zoravik and AGVU New England to the International Armenian Literary Alliance and the Armenian Institute in London. So with the gracious help of Owusu herself, we'll read two passages from her memoir. Today we'll examine how history and a reckoning with history shaped the author's trajectory and structure of the memoir itself. Without further ado, let me introduce our guest. Nadia Owusu is a Ghanaian and Armenian American writer and urbanist. Born in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, she was raised in Italy, Ethiopia, England, Ghana, and Uganda. Her first book, Aftershocks, topped many most anticipated and best book of the year lists, including the New York Times, the Oprah magazine, Vogue, Time, Vulture, and the BBC. It was a New York Times book review editor's choice. By day, Nadia is the director of storytelling at Frontline Solutions, a Black-owned consulting firm that helps social change organizations to define goals, execute plans, and evaluate impact. She earned her MFA in creative nonfiction at the Mountain View Low Residency Program, where she now teaches. Nadia, thank you for your work, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for organizing. And thank you to Mark and to everyone who's joined. And I'm going to read a couple of passages that kind of speak to some of the themes that we're going to be discussing today. One is sort of connected to Ghanaian history and the Ghanaian side of my family, and the other to the Armenian side of my family. And so the first passage that I'm going to read is from a chapter called Colonial Mentality, and it sort of explores pre-colonial, colonial and post-colonial history in Ghana, and kind of takes a very kind of broad survey, but then all of those histories are also explored through the lens of my own experience and my family's experience. So I'll start. It's just a short passage. Indirect rule enabled the British to both cut the costs of governing and to render their power less visible. Ashanti and other tribal leaders, and the Ashanti tribe is the tribe that my father came from. Ashanti and other tribal leaders' loyalties were split between the interests of their people, the interests of the colonial government, and their own self-interest. Titles and money were conferred based on loyalty to the British Crown. Some leaders turned to corruption to gain more power. While the pre-colonial Ashanti government was a monarchy, the Asantehene, the king of the Ashanti, like the chiefs who served him, was elected from a pool of eligible men from the Oyoko clan, my clan. A council of elders and chiefs provided checks and balances. During colonization, this system fell apart. Some of the elites also adopted what my father called British heirs. They turned their noses up at the poor and uneducated, and others they considered beneath them. Perhaps my great-grandfather was not alone in eating fufu with a spoon. Some men abandoned their ontuma, traditional robes, in favor of exclusively wearing Western clothing. Some spoke in British accents. My grandfather, like his father, like my father, had an English-tinged accent. His Ghanaian name was Nana Ohenepa Owusu Koko, but most people called him Peter, or Mr. Owusu. He dropped the Koko from our surname because he didn't trust white people to get the pronunciation right. He didn't want our name to be turned into hot chocolate, Cocoa. He knew his children and grandchildren would live and work in the white world. My father's name at birth was Charles. He went to boarding school in Kumasi, not far from where his family lived. There he got a very good British modeled education. In college in America, he legally changed his name to Osei, his Ghanaian name. I didn't know he used to be called Charles until that trip to Ghana when I was 7. I found a photograph on my grandfather's desk of 2 little girls and a little boy. On the back of the photograph, in my grandfather's neat print, it said Harriet, Violet, and Charles in the garden. I knew who Harriet and Violet were, my father's older sisters. Who's Charles? I asked my father, carrying the photograph out to the porch where he was drinking a beer and watching the sunset. Oh, that's me, he said, laughing, before I decided to get rid of my colonial name. What does Osei mean? I asked. It means noble, he said. I was named after Osei Tutu. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, wrote W.B. Du Bois. He was, of course, writing about the experience of African Americans, of people whose ancestors, my ancestors, sold into slavery. But this double consciousness is true of Africans as well. It is related to colonial mentality. It is related to my father being both Charles and Osei. It is related to my great-grandfather eating fufu with a spoon. It is related to the pride of being Ashanti and the shame of being Bush. During colonization, Ghanaians had to abide by British rules by order of law. After independence, the reasons for continuing to abide by many of the same rules were more complicated. They were about the global economy and power structures. They were about the shame assigned to blackness. Internalized racism and oppression run deep. This can be seen in the fact that many African countries whose leaders fought long and hard for freedom from European rule adopted the European style of government after independence. It can be seen in the raw red skin of some of my aunts and uncles who use bleaching cream to lighten their complexions. I remember thinking it hilarious when I turned on the television in Ghana to find the newscaster reporting on a trial. I have no idea what the case was about, but all the lawyers wore white wigs and red coats as they do in England. The long curled wigs looked even more ridiculous, I thought, against black skin. My father found me rolling on the floor laughing. He took one look at the television and started laughing too, even though it was not a new sight for him. He was delighted by my reaction. That's my girl, he said. You know foolishness when you see it. The Ashanti had a very sophisticated legal system before the British arrived with their powdered wigs. Ghana's first Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah, had intended to study law in London, to earn the right to wear one of those white wigs. Instead, he became a political activist, participating in anti-colonial protests and making friends with leading British communists. Before arriving in London, Nkrumah had earned 2 master's degrees in the United States, from Lincoln University and the University of Pennsylvania. In America, he studied the writings of Karl Marx and Marcus Garvey. Eventually, he brought his activism, his philosophy, to the Gold Coast, where he had been lured back with a job as an organizer with the independence movement. That job did not last, however, as Nkrumah grew impatient with the pace of change. He launched his own party, demanding immediate self-government. In January 1950, Nkrumah launched a nonviolent campaign of strikes, protests, and non-cooperation with the British. He was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison. But the British understood they would lose the Gold Coast. The British government agreed to hold a general election to establish a new majority African government with whom they would collaborate to create a constitution oriented toward eventual full self-rule. In the election held in 1951, the party led by Nkrumah, the Convention's People Party, CPP, won 34 out of 38 seats. This while Nkrumah was still imprisoned. Despite misgivings, colonial leaders decided to release Nkrumah. They feared that unless they did so, the CPP would refuse to participate in the political process, would rile up their supporters, and all hell would break loose. In one day, Nkrumah went from prisoner to prime minister. In 1954, Nkrumah and his party won another election. Nkrumah believed that his legitimacy reinforced progress towards self-government could be accelerated. Then he picked a fight with Ashanti leaders over the price of cocoa. More than half of Ghana's cocoa crop was farmed in the Ashanti region, and many Ashanti people's livelihoods depended on it. Nkrumah announced that he would be fixing the price of cocoa for 4 years at far below the price guaranteed under the colonial government. With support from the Asantehene and the chiefs, a new opposition party, the National Liberation Movement, NLM, was formed. The NLM platform focused on defending the Ashanti economy and culture against Nkrumah's government, which they labeled as both corrupt and disrespectful of their traditions and institutions. Indeed, the board responsible for setting the price of cocoa was engaging in corruption, much of it to benefit supporters of Nkrumah's party through contracts and jobs. Nkrumah dismissed the NLM as the last gasp of old-fashioned tribalism. He saw his government as modern, as the future. There were violent clashes between NLM and CPP supporters. Startled by the division and what it might signify, the British called for another general election. This election, too, Nkrumah won, and with it, the British announced a date for independence, March 6, 1957. As the leader of the new free nation of Ghana, Nkrumah chose as his residence Christiansborg Castle, the slaving fort built by the Danish that had been the headquarters of British colonial rule. The castle, said to be haunted, was a strange place from which to launch a nation, in the halls of colonial power, among the ghosts of enslaved people. Launch a nation, however, Nkrumah did. He quickly built roads, schools, hospitals, and a hydroelectric plant. But what was to be done about the elite class of tribal leaders who expected to continue enjoying the wealth and power that had been granted under colonial rule? What was to be done about the traditional roles of chiefs and kings that had preceded colonialism, the ceremonies, the traditions, the keeping of peace and harmony between the community, the earth, and the ancestors? What was to be done about the fact that some people, who were now Ghanaian, saw themselves as Ashanti or Ga, Ewe, or Fanti first? The tribes had been united against a common enemy, the British, but what united them now? What did it mean to be Ghanaian? I'll stop there. And the next section I'm going to read is engaged with the history of the Armenian side of my family. And similarly, I'm just going to read a short excerpt from a chapter called Blood Trauma. When I was 5, I asked my father why my mother left. His left eye twitched and he cleared his throat. My father did not lie to me, even when the truth hurt. She thought you were better off with me, he said. She was not ready to be your mother. Why? I asked again. There is no simple answer, he said. Your mother grew up in a family that lost everything, and the trauma is in her blood. I think that's what made her leave. After that, I stopped asking why. His words terrified me. I too had lost a lot. I had lost a mother. And if trauma was in my mother's blood, then it must also be in mine. Everyone said I looked like her, except she was white and I was black. I inherited my mother's face and frame, my father's coiled hair and curled eyelashes. My skin color is my mother's olive and my father's ebony, blended in equal parts as though in a watercolor mixing tray. It wasn't until years later, when I was 10 or 11, that my father told me precisely what it was that my mother's family had lost, why trauma was in her blood. He told me that in the years leading up to and during World War I, the Turkish government deported and massacred Armenians en masse. At the time, there were 2 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. By the early 1920s, when the violent campaign ended, it is estimated that 1.5 million Armenians had been killed. Most of those who survived did so by making dangerous treks on foot across the Middle East. They sought refuge in cities like Aleppo and Cairo, cities out of which refugees pour today. Many Armenians eventually found their way west to France and Argentina, Russia and Cuba, and to America. Despite the refusal of the current government of Turkey to use the word genocide, that is what it was. My mother's family members were among those who were killed and those who survived. My great-great-grandmother and my grandfather's 2-year-old cousin were among the dead. The survivors' losses, their loved ones, their homes and earthly possessions, citizenship, hopes, dreams, security, Mount Ahir, pepper and potato plants, looms for weaving cotton, goat's milk ice cream, tea made from the root of purple orchids. In 1915, my maternal grandfather's family was driven out of the town of Marash in the southeastern part of the Ottoman Empire when they refused to convert to Islam. They were Armenian Orthodox Christians. Other families were not given the option of religious conversion to avoid deportation, but the chief of police felt sorry for my great-grandmother because the family was without a patriarch. My great-grandfather had already immigrated to the United States under threat of imprisonment or even the gallows for the crime of treason. He had climbed a pole and replaced an Ottoman flag with an Armenian one. For 9 years after he escaped from the cell where he was being held pending trial, his whereabouts were unknown to his wife and children. 3 hours after my family left Marash, police rode up to the caravan of 650 refugees with whom they were traveling and rounded up all of the Armenian Catholics and Protestants. The Catholics and Protestants were, it was later discovered, all murdered, their bodies thrown in a giant pit to rot. It is unclear why the Orthodox Christians were spared. I cannot remember the order of the ordeals my family faced on their way to America, but they included typhus, temporary blindness, several armed robberies, malaria, near starvation, visa denials from multiple countries, and an earthquake. The story I remember most clearly, though, is that of my great-aunt Arka's abandonments. Between the ages of 4 and 7, Arka, my grandfather's older sister, was 3 times abandoned in the Syrian desert. She was left in the shade of a large rock, under a tree, and on a donkey. The donkey belonged to a man who named Arka as his prize for a goatskin of water. Her mother decided to pay up. Each of Arka's abandonments was reversed by my great-uncles Aram, Artin, and Goran, who could not bear to leave their little sister behind and went back for her. In the case of the goatskin of water bargain, they found her in a village where the man with the donkey had taken her to be his family's servant. She was sitting on a boulder eating a piece of bread. When her new master refused to give her up, her brothers appealed to the tribal chief, who ordered her immediate return to her family. Arka wept bitterly as her brothers led her away. In the strange village, at least she'd been fed. I've heard multiple versions of the story of Arka's abandonments. Once my grandfather, who was not yet born at the time of the events, he was the only one of his siblings born in America, told me his mother was delirious from thirst when she left her daughter behind. Another time he told me she did not believe any of them would make it out of the desert alive. At least without Arka, no one would have to carry an extra burden to their death. Arka was too weak to walk on her own. My great-uncle Aram asserted in a published collection of accounts of the Armenian genocide that Arka had become unbearable with her pitiful crying for water. Crying children, he noted, were a liability. Quiet was crucial. The caravan often walked under the cover of darkness so they would not be attacked by the police or thugs. Aram recalled a vote to strangle a screaming baby to death for fear that she would get them all killed. Fortunately, the negotiation over who would do it took so long that the baby fell into a deep sleep and was saved. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for these beautiful passages, for reading them, sharing them with us. So both of these excerpts seem to emerge from a desire to grapple with your family histories. And in the process, they engage with history with a capital H. So my first question is, could you tell the audience about your research process into these two histories, and how your understanding of them was shaped by your relationship to the parent that carried that history into your life? And in addition, one audience member asked if you struggled with your Armenian identity given your mother's absence. So,
yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. Yeah, so I think, part of the big project of the book was sort of exploring my sense of identity related to belonging to a place or a culture that has never been a simple thing for me. I was raised by my Ghanaian father, but I never lived in Ghana for a long period, and I don't speak his language, Tree. And I'm very close to my aunties and my grandmother and cousins on that side of my family, but there's so much that I miss in terms of language and shared cultural touch points. And even just looking different. When I'm in Ghana, nobody assumes that I'm from there. People ask me where I'm from. At the airport, when officials, when they see my last name in my passport, they sort of give me a strange look, and then they might kind of start a joking interrogation, like, do you speak Tree? Why not? What tribe are you from? What do you know about Ghana? And then definitely kind of to speak to one of the audience members' questions, with the Armenian side of my identity, I was very removed for much of my life. I only saw my mother for short visits, and I think I was shaped more by her absence, and therefore the absence of any deep connection to being Armenian than anything. And when I did visit, I also stood out physically on that side of my family too, because I'm Black. And my Armenian family, they never made much of that, but other people did. I remember neighbors asking my mother if I was adopted. And that sort of thing as a child, I can understand it now, but I think as a child it was difficult for me to understand. And then also I grew up moving to a different country every couple of years because of my father's work with the UN, and so we were always saying goodbye to a place. And so I think that sense of like longing to belong somewhere, paired with an understanding that I never will in an uncomplicated way, is really kind of at the heart of the book. And it also sort of explores a demand that I think is put on so many of us to see our identities as fixed, which leads to kind of fears of rejection. I would always get, as I was saying, really nervous when people asked me where I was from or what my background was, and I felt like my answers often led to more confusion than anything else, or even suspicion. And I think so writing the book and learning more about the histories and cultures helped me work through some of that, and to begin to see myself not as being rootless, but as having really kind of wide and entangled roots, and to claim all of my identities and the multiplicity that is at the heart of who I am. But in terms of my approach to the research, I started this book as a private project. It was something that I was doing just for myself because related to this question, I did have this really strong sense that exploring these histories was a big part of what I needed to do to come out of sort of a dark period of my life. And that, the disconnection from those histories and my inability to kind of contextualize my life within them was something that I was sort of writing through. And so it sort of naturally came to be that I was really interested particularly in oral histories and in firsthand accounts, because I think with both, African history and Armenian history, those are histories that are often mistreated and are written from the perspective that is not of the people who the history belongs to. And so that was sort of something that I was holding as I kind of approached the research on both fronts.
very interesting. Thank you. And I like that term, mistreated histories. I think that's very accurate. So this is a related question. You kind of answered part of it. What compelled you to include these factual, objective, historical passages, which are also informed by witness testimony? And I suppose this is the most important question here. What would have been missing from your memoir in their absence? Now, I know you just mentioned the contextualization was key to your journey, but is there anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, sure. That's such a great question too. I remember really vividly, I think we all have these memories that kind of stick out to us and sort of that we return to over and over again in our lives to kind of, because we believe that they hold some sort of key to understanding who we are in the world. And one of those memories for me was this memory of my father telling me about the trauma of the Armenian genocide. And it was really important to him, although he didn't deeply know that history, but it was important to him that I had some access to it. And I didn't know when he told me about the Armenian genocide, about epigenetics, about how trauma actually can change our genetic makeup and be inherited. I was 7 at the time, but the idea of carrying history in our bodies, and carrying, historical trauma in our bodies kind of stuck with me as I grew up, and was one of the things that really animated this project. And as I said, I sort of started it for myself. But exploring those histories was always at the heart of what I was trying to do. And then once I decided that I was going to, start to see if I could shape this into a book using the raw material that I had started writing for myself, I knew that it had to be a genre fluid book, because that was how it had organically started to take shape when I was just writing and doing the research without thinking, like, what am I going to make of this? And so, it is a memoir, but it was always intended to engage deeply with the history, because I wanted to move back and forth between my more private griefs and struggles to these larger forces that shaped them. And I wanted to show, that truth at the heart of that memory that I kind of held on to, that history is always present in our day-to-day lives, whether we notice it or not. And so, many of the chapters of the book kind of start with a really vivid memory, and then they open up into a broader exploration, for example, in the chapter that I read about Ghana, into sort of the history of colonization and the independence movement in Ghana. But the chapter starts with a memory of going with my father to see, the place where the thrones of the Ashanti kings and chiefs are housed. And, similarly, the piece about the Armenian genocide that I was reading, it starts with a memory of asking my father why my mother left, and then sort of opens up into that exploration of my ancestors' trek. And so, without these histories, I felt that I wouldn't have been able to explain, the realities that are sort of at the heart of my struggles with identity, that are the griefs that I was grappling with. And also, I wouldn't be able to honor the hopes and strengths as well. It wasn't just the griefs that I was encountering, but also the immense hope and strength that I had inherited from both sides of my family, in their fights against oppression. And I think one of the troubles with American culture, for example, is that it can be really ahistorical. And the idea of sort of rugged individualism, for example, it cuts us off from ancestral wisdom and warnings from the past. And the refusal to examine the difficult parts of our history in a truthful way, whether, in America that's the genocide of Native peoples or slavery, it means that we have not done enough work of repair and healing. And I realized that on a personal level, I had made that mistake myself in some ways by not learning more about my histories sooner. And so then in that context, my personal griefs became my own, which, like, through the exploration of the book, was so fundamentally untrue, that those griefs and hopes and longings to belong, like, those were shared by my ancestors in different forms. But it was important for me to connect myself, to reconnect myself to those histories.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a spontaneous question. One of the things you mention in the book from the start is that you've been writing since you were a kid, and that is one of the images that also sticks with me. But since we all know that writing an important project takes a long time, I'm kind of wondering how long was the period from, first conceptualizing the idea as a private project to, doing the program and then publishing the book? How was that?
Yeah, so I mean, by the time the book came out, I had been working on it in some form for over a decade. I started working on it in my 20s. As I said, my kind of mid-20s, as this private project, I had this really strong sense that I needed to kind of make some meaning out of the events of my life, to come to understand them, to examine the griefs that I had not allowed myself to fully feel. And those are sort of the private griefs in terms of my mother leaving, in terms of my father dying when I was 13, but then also these kind of broader forces that shaped those choices and realities in my family's lives. And I felt like if I was going to come out of this period of depression, that I really needed to kind of take on those issues and grapple with them. And so for the first 5 years or so, that was really what I was doing. I was doing a lot of sort of more academic type research, going into the archives to kind of come to some sense of understanding, which is an ongoing project. I certainly don't think that I I think I have a long way to go in terms of both of those histories beyond this book, but that was a key part of it. And then sort of also doing more sort of personal writing and journaling towards that. So yeah, that was about 5 years. And then from there, I began to sort of ask myself, like, could I make a story out of this that others would want to read? And then there was an attempt to turn it into a novel, which sort of fell apart, but I worked on that for a couple of years. The ill-fated novel that sort of collapsed under its own weight. And then sort of took another approach. And so once I started sort of writing it more as kind of a genre fluid memoir and cultural history, then that period of writing was about 3 years.
Well, I think you found the perfect metaphor, the perfect structure, and it worked out very well. So you just addressed some of what I'm about to ask, but I'll just ask it anyways. So how did the process of preparing and writing these historical sections differ from the process of writing other parts of the book related to your personal life? Was there more pressure to be precise and thorough about certain aspects? And clearly you have that awareness and humility to say, you've begun research and no one can really know, all there is to know. But was there a different kind of pressure? And then notably, you speak about the participation of the Ashanti in the slave trade. Why, for example, was it important to include that and to write fairly extensively about it?
Yeah, all really great questions again. So yeah, I mean, it definitely was different. My approach to doing sort of some of the more researched work and writing into the histories and the more personal work that I was doing. And in the beginning, I knew that they were deeply related, but I wasn't giving much thought to how they were going to come together. And the research for me was deeply personal in a way, because it was sort of this this journey towards sort of reclaiming those pieces of my identity from which I had felt very estranged for a long time. But let me step back a bit, I think. So I think when I first started to examine some of the stories that I had been given and been told about my own life, so it did start with the more kind of personal writing, and I kept getting stuck because I wasn't able to sort of understand, how my family ended up in America, for example, or sort of why all my father's sisters were all in the UK. Like I sort of vaguely knew those histories, but I didn't understand them in a deep sense. So then understanding the choices that, my family were making within those contexts was really difficult. And so it was those kind of missing pieces that sort of I found connected the more personal writing to the histories. Like I had to go into the archive to actually understand something about my life or about my parents' life. And so that's sort of how I started to weave them together. And then there were also places where I was sort of writing very deeply personal stories that were often very difficult to look at and reckoning with sort of the most difficult parts of my life. And I'm someone who really loves research. And so then there was some relief then in being like, okay, I'm going to set this aside for a while and I'm going to go off on a tangent on sort of Pan-Africanism, for example, or jazz. I have a long riff about jazz and how the roots of jazz can be found in some of the Ashanti rhythms. But all of those things were ways for me to both sort of get away from some of the more difficult parts of the writing, but then also to make those pieces deeper in some ways. And I also kind of felt that part of what I was grieving and what had sort of launched this project for me was, as I said, that sense of disconnection from the cultures that make up my DNA. And I think many kind of third culture kids, we're called now, are confronted with that sort of disconnection at some point. The question of where do I fit into the histories of my homelands? And in my case, being Ghanaian and Armenian, those histories are not easily accessible in many ways, and are often contested, or erased, or, as I said, mistreated. And they're definitely not typically taught in schools. And so I'd gathered bits and pieces and read some papers and books here and there, but that was starting to feel really insufficient. And so then when I said, okay, I am going to kind of start this deeper research project, beyond sort of what I needed to like fill in the gaps in some of the stories of my own life. Doing that while living in America also presented related and specific challenges. At the time, the United States, of course, still hadn't acknowledged the Armenian genocide, for example. And so although I was able to access a lot of histories about the Armenian genocide, I noticed a kind of gap. I had always been told about the catastrophe that brought my family to America. It was the reason that I am an American citizen, because my father was a Ghanaian citizen, but how to hold that contradiction of having access to these histories that I could find and, these testimonies, but then the official stance being that this never happened, or at least that it didn't happen in the way that the testimonies, spoke to. And so that the space between those things was like something really interesting for me to explore. And I also found that true, to kind of get at your question about sort of the connections between those histories. Like that was one of the things, the chasm between the truth and the official stance. Like I also found that in exploring pre-colonial African history, which is often written from a colonial white Western perspective. And so a lot is misunderstood. And so, part of what I did, as I said, was I kind of turned to more primary sources. I wanted to hear the voices of my family and people like my family who had lived through those histories. And I found, collective oral histories, I'm forgetting the title, but I think it's the Cilician Armenian Ordeal by Paran Kazanjian, for example, in which some of my family members' accounts are actually included. And so that was sort of miraculous to find that. And then similarly with Ghanaian history, I sort of turned to reading a lot of academic papers by Ghanaians and other African scholars, and I kind of had to dig to find those and sort of track them down. But then to come back to your question about including the history of African participation in the slave trade, for example, and other complicated histories, I had learned on a personal level, as I said, that hiding from difficult truths doesn't work, and especially not if what you're after is reckoning and understanding. And there is so much oversimplification that happens. That we have this good and bad binary, and this I think is true when we talk about conflicts between nations and interpersonal conflicts. And I didn't want to fall into that trap. And then also, history is used by some, for example, the history of slavery in America. That history of Ghanaian or African participation in the slave trade is used by some to avoid accountability in America for the horrors of slavery in this country. So people will say, well, Africans sold their own, as though that absolves America from the brutality and then the years of apartheid and ongoing oppression that followed. And so I wanted to tell the truth of that story, which is that, yes, Ghana and other African nations need to reckon with their role in the slave trade more fully, but that slavery in Ghana was no way like the slavery in America. People were not enslaved for life. They did not experience the brutalities that enslaved people experienced here. And so the history is complicated, but not telling it truthfully allows harmful falsehoods to be perpetuated, and also we lose opportunities for connection. Like, what would it look like for Africa and the African diaspora to have a very honest conversation about the history of enslavement within our communities? And so that's sort of why it was really important to me to include even the difficult histories.
Thank you. I agree. So my final question before I hand it over to, before I ask questions from a few of our co-sponsors, you kind of touched on this now about the gap between the truth and the official stance, but I'll ask the question anyways, in any case, in case you have anything to add. So your memoir is very much enriched by your social, political, and historical awareness, and your commitment to honestly narrating what you've learned of your histories. And really, that was one of my favorite parts of your memoir, is how you wove those in so well. Could you speak about what unites these two seemingly disparate histories and places? And were you struck by any parallels as you researched them, whether in the past or in their present reverberations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, one of the things that immediately was clear to me was that those histories are connected through the fact of my body and through my existence. So that was one level. That was the first level at which I approached bringing them together. Like, what did it mean for me to carry those histories within me? And what did it mean to be Armenian, Ghanaian, American, and Black, among all of the other identities that I have? And so that was the first level that I approached it. And then I think that they're also very much connected, and I kind of spoke to this a little before, but through the lens of colonization and cultural disenfranchisement and oppression. You know, what were the connections between those histories if you examine them through those lenses, and where did they diverge? Because it was also really important for me to kind of explore the unique experiences of those things among the different my communities, but then to think about, and what does that mean more broadly, you know, for so many communities across the world. And I think once you kind of start examining those connections, so much cracks open, and you really begin to see themes and to understand the world in kind of new and interesting ways. And also it really cemented for me this notion of kind of shared fates and how much we all have in common, and how much how many ways we're so connected, even though it can seem, you know, that our histories are separate, or that they don't have anything to do with each other, which I found more and more as I was researching and writing to not be the case.
And relatedly, I was going to say that one of the things I really appreciated the commitment with which you told not only your own personal story, but also these stories. And I think it's a really potent way of highlighting and even archiving, because I think you were getting at that too, archiving historical events and processes. And such good faith research in literature, in my opinion, can serve as an antidote to the posturing that unfortunately accompanies the telling of politically inconvenient histories. So on that note, I'd like to we have a question from one of our co-sponsors, my colleague Val Wong, who's Associate Professor of English and Media Studies at Bentley. And she has published a memoir as well, Beijing Bastard, in 2014. And she couldn't be here because of an internet issue, but I'd like to ask her question very quickly before passing it on to Olivia from Yala. So if you could speak to this, Val asks, your memoir takes as its guiding metaphor the earthquake, which beautifully ties together your history on both a literal and figurative level. When in the process of writing did you decide on the structure for the book? And this is my favorite part, how did it help or hinder you from saying what you wanted to say?
Yeah, I love that question too. So actually the kind of earthquake metaphor has sort of an interesting story. And for those who haven't read the book, it actually, there's a real earthquake in sort of the opening chapters of the book. You know, when I was 7, we were living in Rome. I was living with my father, and after a really long absence, separation, my mother kind of showed up at our house on the same day. You know, my father always listened to the BBC World Service, and so the news on the radio that day was about a catastrophic earthquake that had destroyed a city in Armenia. And, you know, I remember, you know, hearing, oh, this city in Armenia, and my father didn't speak that much about my mother, but my mother being Armenian, I thought that this was an opportunity to sort of ask him about her, and then she showed up that day. And so I think the kind of personal earthquake of my mother sort of showing up and sort of shaking the stability that I had, you know, I had gotten used to her absence, and so I think her showing up that day sort of was a private earthquake, and then of course this really destructive, very real earthquake that struck this city. And so I think since then, you know, there's a way, you know, I was talking about memories and sort of the memories that shape us, and similarly, I think there are ways in which we understand the world that shape us. And so the story of an earthquake, you know, has always been something that I've been interested in since then. And so the metaphor kind of started to work its way into the memoir before I even realized that that was happening. And, and then a friend pointed it out to me, sort of one of my early readers. I sent her an early draft of the manuscript, and she said, you write a lot about earthquakes. And I had been struggling with structure up to that point, because I couldn't imagine writing a linear book given all of the different cultures and histories and stories that I was telling, but I knew that I needed to give people enough anchors to hold on to. And so when she pointed out that I was using that metaphor kind of organically, that's when I said, okay, can I do this more intentionally? And I really liked that the story of an earthquake is not linear. We don't really understand it except in retrospect. What we thought was the earthquake actually was a foreshock, and then you have to kind of reshuffle the story. And that's sort of how I felt about, the different narratives that kind of make up my life. So I'm very grateful to my friend for pointing that out to me. And then I think, to answer the question of how did it help or hinder, I think, when I was doing it organically and it wasn't very intentional, it wasn't sort of serving as scaffolding to hold the book together. So then I had to go back and kind of start to do that in an intentional way. But it became very heavy-handed for a while, and I was going overboard with it, and so I had these really long sort of diatribes about earthquake science, and I had done in typical fashion a lot of research about it, and my agent was like, "This is absurd. You can't have all of this in there." So then it was then I had to kind of scale it back, and it took a while to strike a balance that felt right to me.
Nice. Well, I think it works really well. And it is ironic that it's the earthquake that anchors the the book,
Yeah.
because an earthquake is by definition destabilizing.
Exactly,
but it works
which is
very
kind
well.
of fitting in a way, yeah.
Right, exactly. So now I'd like to introduce Olivia Katranjan, who is one of the co-sponsors of the event. She's a writer and journalist based in Luxembourg, a 2021 Creative Armenia AGBU Fellow, a graduate student in creative writing in Oxford, and the founder of YALA, the International Armenian Literary Alliance. And Olivia has a couple fantastic questions to ask Nadia, so I'll just hand it over to her and then we'll wrap up, and that's it. Go ahead, Olivia.
Thank you, Laura. Nadia, welcome. We're so excited to have you and welcome you to the Armenian literary community. I wanted to ask you a little bit about oral storytelling. Toni Morrison has written that Black literature has an oral quality to it. How did the tradition of oral storytelling, call and response techniques, and the idea of ancestors passing down stories through generations influence your writing?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. I definitely was thinking a lot about Toni Morrison, so it's interesting that you sort of bring her up. And I was also very much influenced by by African and Black American storytelling traditions. Growing up, my Ghanaian father told me these bedtime stories that so many Ghanaian children are told from the really ancient Ashanti storytelling tradition. And some of those tales, some people might know them. They're the Anansi the Spider stories. They originated in the Ashanti tribe in Ghana. And in those stories, kind of the earthly and spirit worlds coexist. The ancestors are present in people's everyday lives. They guide us. They interfere with our lives. And, in the Ashanti tribe, they're also known for their sort of percussion and drumming, and in which each drum part is considered a voice, and these voices kind of circle each other in continuous patterns, and they interlock, and the relationship is to the steady rhythm of a bell. And so those rhythms also really influenced me, and as I was saying earlier, they're in the roots of jazz, which I also write about in the book. And what is now Ghana was one of the biggest slave ports. So those rhythms sort of survived the Middle Passage, which I found miraculous. And then also the Anansi stories are now told on the islands of the Caribbean to Caribbean children, and they've taken on new forms, but they also survived the Middle Passage. And so I was really interested in sort of evoking some of the elements of kind of oral storytelling, but also kind of the rhythms of language. That and especially as I was kind of doing that research, and so I tried to to kind of capture that in the rhythm of the language that I used in the use of refrains in the book, in sort of the circular nature. You know, I circle around a lot of histories and then kind of come back to them in other places. And I think what's at the heart of some of that is that in many African cultures, time is not linear. It's not a straight line. It's circular. And there are circles within circles, and we're moving in and out of them. And, you know, again, past and present coexist. And that's very much sort of true in how I imagined the book as well, and is sort of how I experience the world.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think in the more lyrical, you know, prose poetry sections, the reader definitely feels that, hears that rhythm and the rhythmic quality to your prose. I wanted to ask, you draw your family members as complex characters, really full characters on the page in an admirable way. At one point, you talk about your father, who was such an incredible parent and source of love, as a feminist who wanted, you know, his wife to have dinner on the table every night, but couldn't imagine you cooking for a man, which I love that sort of complexity. The reader can sense the compassion that you have for the people in your life, even those who have hurt you. And I wanted to ask you, because I was so moved by it when I heard you talk about it, could you talk a little bit about what you've called writing towards love?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you so much. First of all, that was really nice to hear. And it's been really nice to connect with readers who have sort of, connected with the book in that way. So I really appreciate it. So I think, you know, when I started writing, I was kind of starting from a place of grief. But as I said, I realized that the more I was writing and the more sort of I was exploring the histories, and I found sort of a deep sense of compassion for the people in my life, and the choices that were available to them, and the histories that they were carrying, and their own griefs, and it helped me to kind of let go of some of that sort of rigidness that I had held on to, and to kind of find a sense of connectedness. And once I realized that, it was really clear. I mean, this is something that people say all the time, but I found that it was really true in the writing, is that on the other side of grief is love. You can only grieve things that you have loved and lost. And so it was really important to me to sort of write into that, and to hold on to the idea of sort of, rather than just writing from a place of grief or anger, sort of writing towards deeper compassion and understanding for myself, for others. And within that, then, it was clear that I couldn't reduce anybody in my life to a single story, or even reduce them to sort of who they were in my story, you know, that I needed to sort of allow them the fullness of their humanity on the page in the way that I had allowed myself. And I think with parents, it's always difficult, because as a child, you only see your parents in the context of who they're supposed to be in your life. But as you get older, you know, and, you know, you're sort of at the age when they were when they were sort of raising you, and you realize, like, okay, like, I'm also kind of messing up in the world and making these mistakes, and sort of like, where are my mistakes and theirs connected, and what can we all learn, and how can we have deeper and more compassionate conversations. And so that sort of is where I became really excited about continuing to write the book, was when I sort of found my way writing, coming out of that grief, and sort of writing towards sort of reconciliation, love, and connection.
Thank you.
On that beautiful note, we're going to wrap up the event. So I'd like to thank Olivia and also Val for the excellent questions. Nadia, I'd like to thank you for your participation. It was even better than I expected it would be. So thank you so much for these wonderful answers and thoughtful answers. I'm also pleased that in addition to the Yala event, which Olivia's organized, coming up, I think in November, in conjunction with the Armenian Institute in London, I think, there will also be 2 events at Bentley University. On that, speaking of, I'd like to thank the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Rick Okis at Bentley, the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs, Donna Maria Blancero, the Chair of the Department of English and Media Studies, Ben Aislinger, for amplifying the event by inviting Nadia to be our special guest writer this fall. At Nasser, I'd like to thank Mark Mamigonian, Sarah Ignatius, and Laura Yardumian for championing and promoting the event. Also, Judy Sarian, Ellen Arekian, Nancy Agabian, and Tatiana Der Avedisian for their help bringing this idea to life by facilitating connections among Nadia and the co-sponsors. Thank you, very importantly, to the talented graphic designer Nune Khudaverdian for the beautiful posters. For more of her work, visit nunig.com. Thank you to the co-sponsors, including those not just mentioned, the Armenian Institute in London, Zoravik, and AGBU New England. Finally, thanks to the audience for joining. I hope this event deepened your appreciation for Nadia Owusu's Aftershocks or compelled you to get a copy if you haven't read it yet. The book is available through the Nasser bookstore and other independent booksellers. That's it for me. Thank you again, everyone, and I'll hand it over to Mark.
I won't reiterate all of those thanks, but I will just underscore them and express my appreciation to Laura and Nadia for the excellent work, and for Olivia and all of the co-sponsors for helping publicize the event. And I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. And I do encourage you to check out the book, read it, and deepen your understanding and appreciation of Nadia's work. So thank you, and we will sign off. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.